Today on Eyewitness Newsmakers, Congressman Adam Schiff of Burbank, top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee. We'll get his reaction to the president's comments about ordering the military to guard the border until the border wall is built, and his claim that border laws are weak. And the president declared protections for Dreamers dead, blaming Democrats. We'll ask the congressman if there is any compromise possible. Elections are a month away. Is the State Department plan to counter Russian interference too late?
We need to send a clear message to Russia that any further meddling won't be tolerated. They'll pay a heavy price for it.
And what will happen to California's environmental protections if vehicle emissions are increased?
ABC7 presents Eyewitness Newsmakers with Adrienne Alpert.
Good morning, I'm Adrienne Alpert, and today's guest, Representative Adam Schiff of Burbank, ranking Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee. Congressman, welcome back to this program.
Thank you. Great to be with you again.
Let's look at the border first. The president is determined to send National Guard, said he wanted a military response under Posse Comitatus, can't send anything but the National Guard, but states have to cooperate as well, unless Congress does. What do you think Congress is going to do?
Well, I don't think Congress would support this any more than Congress supports the wall. And the administration and the Secretary of Homeland Security is having a very difficult time explaining why this is necessary when border crossings are down to their lowest levels in decades. You have to go back to 1971 to find a level of border crossing this low. So what's the cause? What's the reason, the justification for sending the National Guard? And they're really struggling to come up with one. I think the reality is they simply want to pressure Congress to build this very unpopular wall. And this is part of the way they want to do it.
Department of Homeland Security Secretary said that there has been an uptick and that this would be in response to that. Said that in the past, both Presidents Obama and Bush have ordered the National Guard at the border, thousands. So what would be wrong with this?
Well, you're right. It's not unprecedented to use the Guard this way. But in the past, there's been a justification for it. It hasn't been a let's order the military or the National Guard to the border and then come up with a reason for it. And that seems to be the case here. The president watches Fox News. He sees a report about a caravan coming to the United States, and all of a sudden he orders out the Guard. Well, the caravan's not coming to the United States. So what's the justification? And they're struggling to come up with one. Now, I think in the past there were reasons at the time. Maybe there were higher levels of border crossings or a bigger problem in terms of narcotics crossings, but they really seem to be struggling with any justification today.
Well, you're on Intelligence Committee, and one of the justifications they're saying is that MS-13 or bad characters are coming through on these, I don't know where in the fence they would be coming through, but they do. Do you see that there's this great influx? And also, what would be the National Guard's role in that interdiction since they can't make arrests? Well,
this is really the big question. What is the Guard being sent there to do? Are they being sent to stop a caravan that's not coming anymore? Are they being sent to make drug arrests when they don't have the power of arrest? Are they being sent to identify where people are crossing the border so that the Border Patrol can be more effective? There needs to be a legitimate justification, and they seem to be in search of one. And that's really the problem, I think, that our governor must be wrestling with right now about whether he ought to accede to this request. And Secretary Nielsen was asked whether or not the Guard would be armed, and reporters told her that, according to Mexican authorities, that they could have guns, but she said they had them previously, but they didn't have ammunition. Yes, I'm not sure I understand how that works or makes sense. I would be concerned in part that if you send people that are at least ostensibly armed, if there are people coming across the border who are armed, who think that they're at risk, our border guard may not, our National Guard may not be able to defend themselves. So we have a governor of California, Jerry Brown, who, according to his office, has told me that they are consulting with the California National Guard before they have a response. As of this taping, there was no response yet from California. What do you think it should be? I think they should demand a real explanation for why are you asking us to deploy our Guard troops? Why are you asking us to deploy a Guard that has been extraordinarily utilized, sometimes overutilized, during the last 17 or 18 years of war? What's the justification? And I think we ought to insist on one and an understanding of what those troops might be used for before we agree to anything that this president is proposing.
And finally, it should be pointed out that there are about 255 Guard in California on active duty, most doing work on drug smuggling down in San Diego, but about 55 on the border, I think, for observation purposes.
Well, and again, I come down to this. If this is simply the president reacting to what he sees on Fox News, that's not a good enough reason for the governor to deploy National Guard. If this is simply a way of trying to leverage Congress to build his wall, that's not a good reason. If they have a good reason, they need to set it out, and then the governor can decide. But what I have seen so far doesn't justify the use of the National Guard.
All right, coming off the ideas of the wall, DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, young immigrants who came with their parents as children who know nothing but this country, that DACA program the president has now declared is dead. In reaction to lack of funding from Congress for the wall?
Well, there was a proposal that the Senate and House leadership, Democratic leadership, made to the president. The president seemed to accept. And then the hardliners got to the president, Steve Miller and others in his cabinet, and people like Ann Coulter and others going on Fox and on radio and saying the president is granting amnesty. And then all of a sudden the president adopted a really hard line, attacking family-based immigration and other things. And so the president scuttled that deal. The reality is that Democrats are determined to make sure we have a solution for the Dreamers. Obviously, we deeply support this. Many of the Republican members of Congress support it. If we could get a vote on a clean DREAM Act bill, it would pass overwhelmingly. We can't get the Speaker to allow a vote. We can't get the Senate leader to allow a vote. And this president claims to want to help the Dreamers, but doesn't, because if he decided tomorrow to urge Congress to take up that bill, it would come flying out of the Congress, and that problem would be solved. The president doesn't want that problem solved. He just wants his wall. That's all he seems to care about. He is trying to use the fate of these young people as a leverage to get a deeply unpopular wall. And I think it's immoral to hold these young people's lives in abeyance for that reason.
Well, he's blaming Democrats. Is there anything Democrats can do that would make some kind of compromise sense to get this forward?
Well, yes, and the Democratic leadership offered that to the president, and that seemed to be what he was asking for. But of course, with this president, it's always a moving target. He appears to react to the last person talking in his ear, and sadly, the last person talking in his ear is usually Fox and Friends in the morning. And they call him out. You've got some of the right-wing commentators saying that the president should be impeached because he has reneged on his immigration hard line, and that has apparently frightened the president. And so he's walked away from an agreement that appeared to have been reached.
But you are aware, Congressman, that many people in this country feel as the president does. On this program, I get many, many emails, people saying these people are here illegally, all of them, send them back.
You know, there are certainly some people who feel that way. The president himself claims not to feel that way, although who really knows what the president thinks. But the vast majority of Americans are very much on the side of the Dreamers and want there to be a solution that allows them to stay. And that's the majority of Democrats, but it's also the majority of Republicans. So yes, there is a hardcore anti-immigration base of the president that he appeals to at those rallies that loves the idea of a great big wall. But they're in the minority, and the president seems to be using these young lives as his leverage.
Congressman Schiff, we have to take a break right now, but when we come back, we will talk about the EPA and Scott Pruitt and California's emission laws.
You're watching Eyewitness Newsmakers.
All right, we are back with Congressman Adam Schiff of Burbank, and we're going to talk about the EPA and Scott Pruitt, the environment, and new laws that say the federal government wants to say California can't have stricter environmental laws for cars than the rest of the country does. What happens to California's goals for emissions control?
Well, this is really, in my view, breathtaking in more ways than one. But here you have the prospect of the federal government telling states like California how much pollution we need to have in our air. You know, we love the fact here in Los Angeles that we can go out on a nice day and see the mountains crystal clear. It wasn't that way in the 1970s, but because we enacted these laws to take a lot of that filth out of our air. There are fewer days where we're told we need to stay indoors and people with asthma need to be careful. Now the federal government wants to go back to those dirty skies here in California. We're going to fight that in every way. It's bad for our health. It's going to add cost at the pump. And it makes no sense. These folks that claim to be for states' rights apparently are not for states' rights if it interferes with the work of the big oil companies.
It seems to me the logic for this imposition is that you're forcing the automakers to come up with two standards for vehicles, which costs them too much. What can Congress do, if anything, about this?
Well, Congress can fight it. Congress doesn't have to go along with this. Congress passed fuel efficiency standards for cars. But right now, we don't have a majority that is willing to stand up for our environment. Unfortunately, the GOP in Congress is very much on the same page with Scott Pruitt, who has, I think, single-handedly done everything he can to undermine the whole mission of the Environmental Protection Agency. It's not about protecting the environment anymore under his leadership. It's about assaulting the environment. Congress doesn't have to go along with that, but this majority, unfortunately, does seem willing to go along with that.
Next question. This is about the census coming up. On this program, Secretary of State Alex Padilla said that President Trump is trying to sabotage the census. And in fact, they have now added a question, are you a legal resident of this country, which they believe now will result in an undercount. Do you?
It will result in an undercount. It will further discourage people from participating in the census. And that's by design. That's the whole point of this initiative. And I think it's twofold. One, it plays to that xenophobic base of the GOP, but also this is a way of undercounting in states like California that have a lot of immigrants, which will mean fewer representatives of Congress from these states, which means that the Congress will become more of a red Congress than it is.
Many people in response to this question wrote to me and said, well, these people aren't here legally, they shouldn't be counted anyway. What does the census actually say you have to do? Well,
the census says that everybody needs to be counted, and that information is really important in terms of knowing where people live, where people are concentrated, and what do we need to do in terms of our urban planning, in terms of meeting the needs of people that are constituents in our communities. It also goes into how we apportion representation in Congress. So we use that data. It needs to be good data. And I think what's really going on here, and we've seen this in multiple ways, is this president is vindictive. He wants to punish California. So he wants to weaken our air standards. He wants to tax us more by doing away with the deduction for states that have high local or state taxes. And now he wants to diminish the representation in Congress because that representation doesn't vote with him.
All right, Russian election meddling, 2016, we know they did. We believe they are in 2018. And now the State Department has launched a $40 million initiative to counter Russian election meddling in 2018. Sounds like they're going to give grant money to organizations that would count. How would they do this?
Well, they're very late to doing this because that money, far more than that amount of money, had been allocated to the State Department for the purpose of countering the Russian malign efforts, and they've sat on it. And indeed, not just the State Department, but other departments of federal government have not been doing what they should. And the problem is that the leaders of those agencies, the cabinet members, are afraid to raise this with the president because the president considers any talk about Russian interference in our election as threatening his legitimacy. But what the State Department could do is they could, as you say, they could provide grants to organizations that, like the German Marshall Fund, has a great program of identifying what Russian trolls are doing. They've often given us better information sometimes than we get from the social media companies. They've identified, when Russian bots get behind certain hashtags that are used in the American political process to amplify them. So they could support efforts like the German Marshall Fund. But again, they're coming very late to this. The midterms are taking place now in some states. Our own midterm just a couple months away. And we've done, I think, really nothing that we need to do to protect ourselves in November.
So do you think they're meddling now?
Yes. I mean, the Russians, James Comey testified last year the Russians would be back. In fact, the Russians have never left. And we see Russian activity around a number of things in our political discourse. when the president was taking issue with NFL members who were taking a knee, the Russians got involved in that campaign. They look at these divisive issues, often issues along racial lines, these divisions in our society, and the Russians get involved to try to aggravate, to pit Americans against other Americans.
All right, so much of that is social media. When we come back after this break, we'll talk about the Facebook. We will also talk about the Russia investigation and what's the difference between being a target and a subject of an investigation. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
You're watching Eyewitness Newsmakers.
Congressman Adam Schiff, your House Intelligence Committee has now abandoned any more of the Russia meddling investigation. Is that correct?
Well, not exactly. The Republicans have. At least they've abandoned the Russia part of the investigation. They apparently still want to investigate the FBI and the Department of Justice and Christopher Steele. So they really continue to want to do an investigation that benefits the president. But they don't want to look at what the American people charged them with investigating, and that is, what did the Russians do, and did they have the help of U.S. persons affiliated with the Trump campaign? Now, on our side of the aisle, we continue the investigation. We're bringing in the whistleblower from Cambridge Analytica to testify in a couple weeks. So we're determined to do the people's business, but the Republicans have walked away.
We now know that there are millions more whose accounts were compromised by Cambridge Analytica. Does that trouble anybody in trying to come up with some way to make that stop?
Absolutely, and in fact, just within the last 24 hours, Facebook acknowledged the numbers were a lot higher than we thought. It now appears that 70 million Americans may have had their data illegally acquired or improperly acquired by Cambridge Analytica for the purposes of targeting them in the election. And perhaps 10 to 20 million of other people outside of the United States.
A couple quick things we need to get to on the Russia update. Robert Mueller now views the president as a subject, not a target of his investigation. As a former federal prosecutor, explain to us what that means.
Well, first of all, I can't confirm whether those reports are accurate, but generally, and this is not a precise science, when you begin an investigation, if you have credible information that someone has violated the law, they're the target of the investigation. During that investigation, it may come to your attention that other people may have also violated the law, and those may be in the category of subjects of the investigation until you reach a certain quantum of evidence, and then they become a target as well. So it's not something you can, I think, very precisely define. But they're also not fixed categories, and there's no obligation on the part of the prosecutor to tell someone when they've gone from being a subject to being a target of the investigation. Let's
talk very quickly, if we can, about the earthquake early warning system. I know we're kind of jumping around here, but that's something that was near and dear to you. It certainly is important to California. The president tried to cut it out of the budget for all intents and purposes. What happened? It was restored.
It was, and not only restored, but significantly augmented. We have very good bipartisan support for this program. Ken Calvert, my Republican colleague, and I have worked very closely on this. This year we got the largest allocation ever, $23 million to help build out this system. It's going to give people, when it's done, advance notice when an earthquake is coming. Now, not by days, we can't predict earthquakes, but because the earthquake waves travel through the ground slower than we can communicate, you can tell people you've got 30 seconds till the earthquake reaches you, 20 seconds, get to a safe place, stop a surgery, stop a train. It will save a lot of lives.
Japan has that now. When is California going to have this, or the West Coast?
We hope in the fall to do a limited rollout of the program, but it will probably take another year or two to fully put in the seismic monitors up the entire West Coast of the United States. But at some point, hopefully within a couple of years, you'll be able to get a message on your smartphone telling you how soon that quake may reach you and how strong it will be.
And shut down trains, stop operations, and do all those things that are so important.
And do some of those things in automated fashion, so it can be done without even a human intervening to stop the train.
Can't let you get away without talking quickly about gun control as well. Where does that stand in Congress? Any kind of background check, compromise, anything?
You know, I think what these young people have done from Parkland is really ignite a national movement. They have changed the calculus. What they were able to accomplish in Florida was dramatic with that legislature. Congress is the toughest nut to crack. Universal background checks are supported by the overwhelming majority of Americans, including a strong majority of NRA members. And we're just going to have to fight to get this done. And I think that the midterm elections will give not only those young people, but young people all over the country and everyone else the chance to hold their representatives accountable and demand background checks or throw them out of office.
In about 30 seconds that we have left, though, you recently wrote an opinion piece on Democrats and those midterm elections and came up with some ideas that Democrats need to convince voters about that would make them vote for them.
And I think the answer is really three things. We need to run on the economy because in many parts of the country, people are still suffering, still trying to get by. But also, I think Democrats need to become the party of family values and decency because the GOP has completely abandoned those ideals. A family values party is one that doesn't want to separate kids from their parents. It wants to make sure that parents can provide health care for themselves and for their kids. Wants to make sure that they could send their kids to school and not have them get chased down the hallway by someone with an assault weapon. Democrats have become the party of family values, and particularly in a Stormy Daniels world, we're also the party of decency.
All right, you just brought up another topic, but we can't get to it. They told us we just have to wrap up. Please come back and see us again, Congressman.
Thank you.
All right, Eyewitness Newsmakers will be right back.
You're watching Eyewitness Newsmakers.
Thank you for joining us this morning for Eyewitness Newsmakers. If you have comments about this program, we invite you to join the conversation on Twitter and Facebook at ABC7 Adrian. For all of us at Eyewitness News, I'm Adrian Alpert. Thanks for watching.